as we started a little bit late on the recording, for those people who will later listen to the recording, you just come in time for me to introduce the panel. And I do it in the order of the panelists. So we start with Tatiana Zhurzhenko, who is a research fellow at the Center for East European and International Studies in Berlin, the ZOIS, and she also teaches at the University of Vienna. She has widely published on issues of memory politics, borders and border regions, post-conflict societies, and gender and feminism. And her recent publications include a co-edited volume from 2017, War and Memory in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, which is probably very relevant for what we are discussing today. The next person, and welcome, Yuliya, I haven't seen you before. Very warm welcome, and thank you very much for being here. It's Yuliya Yurchenko, who is a senior lecturer in political economy at the Department of Economics and International Business at the University of Greenwich, and also a researcher at the Political Economy, Governance, Finance and Accountability Institute at the same university. She works on state, capital and society relations, as well as public services and the commons, with a regional focus on Europe and Ukraine. And she's the author of Ukraine and the Empire of Capital, From Marketization to Armed Conflict, which came out in 2018. Thank you and welcome, Yuliya. Then the next panelist is Anna Lazareva. Also, thank you very much, Anna, for being here. So she earned her BA in Political Science and Economics at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany, and she's currently completing her master's degree in Political Science here at the University of Vienna. And she has specialized in Eastern European politics. She also works for the human rights organization LiberEco and assists them with projects in Belarus and Ukraine. Welcome, Anna. The next person or the next panelist is Edgars Eihmanis, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Willy Brandt Center for German and European Studies at the University of Wrocław and the Johan Skytte Institute of Political Studies at the University of Tartu, and where he is also physically based. So Edgars has worked on the political economy of taxation in East Central Europe, the political economy and issues of identity in the Baltic states. And he is the author of many articles, including one, again, which might be relevant for here, cherry picking on external constraints, Latvia and economic governance. Next panel on the person on the round table is Anatoli Reshetnikov, who is an assistant professor at international relations at Webster University in Vienna. And his research interests include identity politics, institutionalized political trolling, conceptual history, critical and linguistic approaches to social analysis, and Russia's international politics. And he's currently also working on ongoing projects, including what they call the trickster turn in Russian foreign policy, and various conceptions of national greatness. One article I think relevant for our context would be a co-authored piece on why Russia's strategic deception is popular, the cultural appeal of the tricksters, which came out in 2018. And then last but not least, we have Yuliya Baumann, who is a research fellow at the Geschwister Scholl Institute for Political Science at the University of Munich. And her research focus lies in the field of comparative authoritarianism and includes electoral authoritarianism, local elections in authoritarian regimes, subnational authoritarianism, opposition strategies under competitive authoritarianism. And all of these have a focus on Eurasia. She's the author of numerous articles, including a co-authored piece on how Russian corporate lobbying in the EU works, and a new report by Transparency International on Transparency Russia. So thank you once again very much, everyone, for agreeing to be on this roundtable. I give now the floor to Tobias, who will explain to the audience the format. And I would also like to just mention one thing for the audience to intervene, because it's a very big panel and large audience. So we ask you to put your questions or statements in the chat, and then Tobias and I will, during this 1.5 hours that we have, will basically, give your questions to the roundtable. So with this, Tobias, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Doro, for the introduction, and also thank you for the panelists to be able to join. Without further ado, I mean, we agreed that all panelists will have an initial statement of maximum 7 minutes, and they will cover, as Doro said, a vast range of topics. And afterwards, we're going to have a panel discussion. And if you have a question, you can happily type them into the chat. So we won't have like direct questions from the audience, because otherwise, I think it's not going to have an end today. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Tatiana Zhurzhenko, and she will talk about the humanitarian aspects of the crisis, especially in Eastern Ukraine. So Tatiana, please.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. Thank you to my dear colleagues at the Institute for Political Science for organizing this panel. I think it's a very important, although also difficult times for people working on Ukraine and people having ties with Ukraine. I must say I'm not an expert on humanitarian aspects of the military conflict. For years, I have studied memory and identity politics with a focus on
I think we lost Tatiana.
My relatives and friends are still there. Today, I'm speaking not only as an expert on Ukraine, but as someone who has a chance to convey their voices to the Western public. So today we have like the third week of the Russian invasion, although it feels like actually like one long day. It started with major rocket strikes at different places all over the country. So very early, we knew that it's going to be a full-scale war. But Russia announced this as a special military operation. And in the beginning, and I remember talking to my friends at the first night, we hoped that the Russian military will not target civilian objects. But very soon it became clear that if Putin had plans to finish this war very quickly, it is not going to happen. And what we see in the last days is a war of attrition, which has impact on millions of civilians, and not only civilians with Ukrainian passports, but also different categories, including, for example, dozens of thousands, or I don't know the exact numbers, of foreign students who have been studying in Ukrainian universities. So the Russian army is deliberately destroying key civilian infrastructure, leaving population without heating, electricity, and gas. As for today, 1 million people Ukraine-wide is without electricity, 250,000 without gas, and we are talking about -10 degrees Celsius. We see major rocket and artillery bombardments of big and small Ukrainian cities, hitting residential hospitals, schools, kindergartens. Yesterday we saw photos of the maternity hospital in Mariupol being bombed. Today a psychiatric ward, home for mentally disabled in Kharkiv Oblast, was bombed. As of yesterday, the official numbers I found is 549 civilian deaths and around 1,000 injuries, but we have to understand this is the very top of the huge iceberg, because the real numbers, which will be much, much higher, and they are growing. And it is not a collateral damage. The aim is to break people psychologically and to squeeze civilians from the cities so that the Russian army can fight a Syrian-style war with the Ukrainian army and those who chose to stay and defend their cities. And in big cities, there is still and many people who chose to stay and defend their cities. So the humanitarian situation is dramatic in many places. First of all, in the relatively big city Mariupol, a Ukrainian stronghold at the Azov Sea, the city is continuously shelled and besieged by the Russian army. Humanitarian convoys cannot reach it. We have no contacts with colleagues who are trapped in Mariupol. So today I tried to help colleagues from the University of Graz to establish a contact with someone who applied for a fellowship, and we have no contact to this person for days. Dozens of small towns and villages are destroyed and people have nowhere to live. Russia is preventing the delivery of humanitarian aid to places under siege and does not respect green corridors, which are provided by the Ukrainian authorities for the evacuation of civilians. People have been evacuated under shelling. We saw photos, dramatic photos from Bucha, Hostomel, and other suburbs of Kyiv, where civilians had to cross the river by foot under fire. And several families with children were killed during this evacuation. As Ukraine and Russia cannot agree on green corridors, Russia offers its own green corridors to the Russian territory, so civilians are exposed to this choice of dying under bombs or being evacuated to the territory of the aggressor state. And this is something which can be called forced displacement. As for today, there are 2.5 million people who left the country, 1.5 million to Poland, but there are also internally displaced persons who left their homes but stay in Ukraine because they prefer to stay closer to their relatives. They hope to return home soon. The number of these people is difficult to estimate. The Russian aggression in Donbass in 2014 produced 1.5 million IDPs, but today we are dealing with much larger area of fighting. This morning, Russia struck with rockets some places in Western Ukraine where actually people go to for looking for safety, and such strikes will of course increase this feeling of insecurity and will push even more people out of the country. The refugee crisis, similar to the one in 2015, is what Russia tries to create in Europe, in my eyes, and this is a deliberate strategy. It's an instrument to humiliate the EU and to punish it, and so we should be clear about it. I think I am out of my time, right?
You're quite close to it, yes.
Yeah, in the next round, I can say something about Kharkiv because I'm kind of following what's going on there online. I'm subscribed to Telegram channels of the main, Kharkiv authorities and so on. So I can tell more about this city.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tatiana, and we'll surely come back to you. We stay in Ukraine, also literally, because Yuliya is currently in Ukraine. I'm very happy that you could make it, and you will be looking behind the veneer of geopolitics and explore the transnational class dimension in generally tensions and competition since Ukraine's independence. So Yuliya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I sort of suspected that a lot of people will be talking about more sort of contemporary current situation, and I wanted to give a bit more of a background context as to why is this happening at all in Ukraine right now, and what will need to happen to prevent this from happening again. Because how I see it, and those of you who are familiar with my work will know this, that what is going on in Ukraine right now? Ukraine is now positioned in a phase of reinvigorated phase of what I called in my book the bloody winter of its political history that started with the murders on Maidan in early 2014, and we need to understand how we ended up here. And to understand that, we need to understand that the post-Soviet space, and Ukraine in particular, positioned on the crossings of reinvigorated geopolitical rivalries and conflicting agents of empire of capital with its internal competitions and shifting spatial and social boundaries. And it is torn between inequalities, economic crisis, predatory capital, homegrown and from elsewhere, various forms of conflict, struggles for geopolitical presence between Russia and the new old West. And these empires and imperialisms cannot be reduced, of course, to state boundaries and their assumed associated interests. We have seen the role of oligarchs. We have seen what's been going on with sanctionings. We have seen how important supply and value chains and interconnections between them and interconnections between Western and Russian and Ukrainian capital have been in attempting to even design sanctions, let alone administer them. So those connections are extremely important. These kind of imperialistic capitalist connections, of course, also have a geopolitical dimension, especially when tensions arise between them. And it is in that sense that Ukraine, in my understanding, fell victim to the relentless spread of the empire of capital, where Russian and Western capitalist geopolitical imperialisms collided, and now they're in their militarist phase since 2014 that have been facilitated by social divisions that local oligarchs in their political games are partly responsible for. They've been doing this divide and conquer thing through their PR agents. So imperialism in 21st century, we must understand, must be seen as a combination of geopolitical, economic imperialisms. But ideologically, they're not dissimilar, because if we look at what is so-called West doing and EU specifically, or the Russia doing, they're ideologically similar entities. Russia is not a counterweight to the United States. It's not an extension of the USSR, no matter what some kind of hardcore Stalinists still believe in the West. It's a dysfunctional KGB-run oligarchic kleptocracy, and we must see it for it. And that dysfunctional KGB-run oligarchic kleptocracy runs its domination on a Gramscian/Machiavellian formula of domination by deceit and fraud, by producing fake news, by blocking social media. We've seen what they're doing now, but that's nothing new, really. By creating by manipulating social and regional divisions in Ukraine as well, and that of course have been produced and reinforced for political convenience and electoral games by political technologies of Ukrainian oligarchs. But that kind of allowed Russia to manipulate and play various groups and regions against each other in their divide and conquer neo-imperialistic ambitions. So that those kind of manipulations have been made possible by that. Ukraine now, as I've already mentioned, is in this reinvigorated phase of a bloody winter of its political history, and it should have been anticipated. There are a lot of surprising narratives and surprised eyes we see from different commentators. And for anybody who's been paying attention, especially since 2014, it shouldn't have come as any surprise, because we didn't then we could have not expected that Ukraine would disintegrate. However, even then, analysis and warnings of such possibility existed. So when rebellion started, this anti-Maidan protest started in the east of Ukraine, there were already commentators who were writing about it. And instead of actually understanding how it happened and what happened, both Ukrainian and Russian side kind of exaggerated and portrayed as ubiquitous certain narratives and certain social forces instead of meaningfully engaging and reconciliating certain tensions. And similar fictions were manufactured and disseminated with vengeance via Russian and separatist media about, for example, fascist junta that allegedly took power in Kiev in 2014. And that Novorossiya project that now we see kind of again brought back with vengeance, it was in full launch in 2014 already, and according to Putin, it included territories of Kharkiv, Lugansk, Donetsk, Kherson, Nikolaev, and Odessa. They were the oblasts, according to him, that were not part of Ukraine prior to the Russian Revolution, but were granted by the Soviets. And we see this kind of reinvigorated rhetoric of denial of Ukraine's historic subjectivity, its right to exist independently of Russia and its imperialistic ambition. And many of those tropes tropes are repeated now louder again by the Kremlin, and many on the left again, many lazy analysis didn't help. Like since 2014, there were a lot of people on the left who have repeated this mantra that Ukraine has become a fascist state, which I'm happy to discuss later as to why that is not true, and why that is a really dangerous trope that actually helped the Russian, the Kremlin's fake news machine, and helped create this kind of this brotherly hatred in the last 8 years. So one of the things that we need to remember, that what happened in 2014 and what made this situation a little bit more combustive this time, is that instead of a systemic change in the country that followed the events of on Maidan and the beginning of this bloody winter with the annexation of Crimea and the separatist movement in Donbass, the armed conflict, this armed conflict broke out, with civilian involvement, and oligarchy was left largely intact. And even later, when Zelensky and the Servant of the People Party came into power on the assumed promises to democratize the establishment and disempower oligarchs and improve the standards of living, all of those kind of like big slogans, and ambiguous and ambitious, there was little implementation of it, and there was a lot of disenchantment amongst demoralized masses. There was a lot of frustration with them. So this kind of, military fervor that we see now, once the dust settles, these the kind of big heroes, Zelensky and his team, they still don't quite have the economic program to implement the promises that on which they won the pre-existing elections, because they still, like, the oligarchic order is still intact. And what needs to happen? Do I have time for like 3 theses as to what needs to happen, or shall we leave it till later? Because I realize that I'm kind of on the brink of 7 minutes.
It depends on how quick you can deliver them.
I can deliver it in about 30 seconds.
Do it, please.
Okay, so what needs to happen for Ukraine to actually meaningfully become a more stable country? Because unifying factor, thanks to Putin, there is, we're one whole nation now, just regardless of who is what. There needs to be a transfer of oligarchic enterprises into collective ownership and management of their workers. There needs to be mass state investment in reconstruction programs and support for small and medium enterprises, reconciliation programs, reconciliation programs, separation from politics and economics. There needs to be foreign debt cancellation, reparations, foreign aid, which is actually reparations for international inaction of the last 8 years, and extraordinary changes to the rules of engagement between EU and Ukraine on their trade agreements, where the state is allowed to be an investor into the society and into the economy so it can be rebuilt. I'm going to stop at that, and I can tell you more about my big reconstruction program later during the Q&A. Thank you. Great,
we're eager to hear about it. But first, we're going to move to Anna, and she will talk about kind of the information war, about disinformation and propaganda. So Anna, please.
Okay. Yes, thank you for inviting me. So yes, Russia's information warfare has started years before it aimed Ukraine. The Kremlin has fundamentally learned from its, I would say, most unpopular war in Chechnya, which has started in 1994. During this time, there were independent media channels that actively criticized Kremlin's policy in Chechnya. And this was kind of one of the main reasons for public dissent regarding this war. So this is when the Kremlin realized it has to get rid of independent media organizations in order to obtain power over public opinion. During the second Chechnya war in 1999, I mean, it has started in 1999, and Putin was already prime minister, so in power. The Kremlin was way more successful in gathering public acceptance within Russia. So the Kremlin basically took over all the nearly all the spheres of public opinion formation by promoting its very own narratives, and at the same time by banning all alternative views. Even more lessons on information warfare were learned in the war with Georgia in 2008, when not only Russia, but also compatriots in Georgia were addressed through Russian media coverage. Similar tactics were applied during the annexation of Crimea, which we are all familiar with. Now I would like to address the relevance of disinformation in the current war and its origins. There are numerous false narratives regarding Ukraine, spread by Russian media, And I would like to focus on one particular. I think it's the most outstanding one, namely the idea of freeing Russians from Nazis and fascists in Ukraine. So here's the question, why this narrative resonates so much with Russian society. The currently dominant narrative of Nazis in Ukraine is not new at all. The claim that fascism does still exist in Ukraine is based on historical memory of the Russian world. So the call for the audience to destroy fascists and Banderovцы was already spread in 2013. Just to remind you, but Stepan Bandera was a Ukrainian political activist and a leader of the Ukrainian nationalist movement in Western Ukraine, and they fought for Ukrainian independence in the 30s and 40s, and in their fight against the Soviets, they eventually, like the movement, saw a possible ally in the Nazis. So the term serves as the ground for framing Ukrainian nationalists as Banderovцы. And this narrative in respect to Ukraine has historical roots, and it was preserved by state-owned Russian TV for years. Euromaidan was framed through the Bandera notion, regarded as an expression of nationalism and neo-Nazism. This narrative then triggered fears in particular audiences and contributed to the separatist movement and the Donbass war. From then on, several events were framed according to the nationalist notion. For instance, the shutdown of the passenger aircraft MH17 in 2014. It was framed in many different ways, but blaming Ukrainian nationalists was the dominating narrative in the Russian discourse. So, moreover, since 2013, TV and social media was full of false claims regarding atrocities planned and carried out by pro-Ukrainian extremists. So, most of the currently used narratives have been actively developed and maintained for many years, adding up to a collective memory of Russians and also of the compatriots consuming Russian media abroad. Many people who are now confronted with deviating information either do not believe it or simply say, well, I don't know what to believe. To sum up, Russia's disinformation campaign has built on historical memory, specifically World War II and Nazi atrocities, but also the rise and fall of the USSR. So, I think this is why these narratives can successfully be deployed within Russia now. But we should not forget about the impact disinformation has also outside of Russia. So, for instance, my own uncle refuses to leave Odessa, claiming that the operation is all about finally freeing or replacing the drug addict and fascist government. Or my aunt, who is in Germany by now, who is still talking about the alliance of our government with the Banderovцы, so which might seem insane to some of us, but yes. At the moment, most media here refers to Russians when bringing up the topic of disinformation. But we shouldn't forget that Russia's disinformation strategies abroad have contributed to a profound division in Ukraine, of the Ukrainian society in the past. The annexation of Crimea, but also the separatist movement in the East have been strongly supported by parts of local citizens. And both events have contributed to long-term destabilization within the Ukrainian society. And Russian channels were banned in Ukraine after the events of 2014, of course. But afterwards, there were still many channels owned by pro-Russian oligarchs, dissenting skepticism towards Western institutions, the EU, and most importantly, the Ukrainian government. Aiming not only compatriots, but also those citizens who are actually pro-Ukrainian. And although now Ukraine seems like a unified and nearly consensual society led by a very charismatic leader, it is certainly not the case. Western media currently talks about how Zelensky has won the information war, and I think it's a very complicated issue. He might have won this war in Europe or in the West, and I'm also sure that many Ukrainians also support him on this issue, but we should really not forget about the cumulative effects of disinformation campaigns leading to long-term instability and distrust as we currently witness in Russia. So to conclude, disinformation is a crucial topic, and I think there are countless facets to it, and there might be implications that go beyond our imagination. Well, I think that's it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Anna. And we're going to move to the Baltics and Edgars, and he will talk about the Baltic perspective towards Russia, but also obviously towards the war. So Edgars, please.
Thanks, Toby. Thanks, Doro, for inviting me and for organizing this event. This is super important. So, as regards the Baltics, of course, the main thing which is on everybody's mind is that the possibility that the Baltics could be next, that they could follow after if Putin really has a broader agenda for expanding his sort of ambition, then we could be next, and that's sort of but that's a sort of geopolitical IR question, and it's difficult to comment on this, and it's also sort of emotionally difficult. So, but I guess the main point that I will try to convey here is that, and is basically what happens in Russia is extremely important for the Baltics, because whatever happens there, basically we will have to live with it because we have the border with Russia and Belarus. I'm originally from Latvia, so I'm a bit, my perspective obviously is biased with that place, but I'm currently living in Estonia, which helps me to bit balance out. But of course, Latvia is in a way, most vulnerable. It's most ethnically divided, most exposed to Russia economically, but also most least developed. And to a large extent, all these things, ethical divisions, exposure to Russia, and economic development, they sort of are correlated. But that's a broader issue. Okay, I would like to make three blocks of points. First of all, Baltic perceptions of Russia. I think this is in. This war really has changed also how I think for many people, the perspective of the Baltics might have changed, but definitely I have changed my perspective, my own perspective on how I see the Baltics, because in Western Europe, and I was sort of socialized as in political science also. Security is an abstract concept, but in the Baltics, it has always had this, existential flavor to it. It's always been about, existential anxiety, and the whole, the republics of the last 30 years, the new independent republics, they basically, this anxiety basically has been embedded in law politics, but also in everyday interactions as people live. And of course that relates to very painful history by we were occupied by Stalin, then by Nazi forces, then again by Stalin, and thousands of people were deported. Baltic elites were deported to Siberia by Stalin. Hugely painful memories. So basically, and then when the new states were constructed, it was all about nationalist politics. It was about the state continuity, extremely restrictive citizenship and language laws, ethnic politics at its most extreme, and Doro has written about nationalist and how Baltics are different in the sense how their social contracts are made. They're very different from this sort of more welfare oriented states in the Visegrad. And I myself have been very critical actually about these nationalist tendencies, because basically what they do, they really put all other issues, they basically subordinate any other issues. You cannot talk meaningfully about economic development, welfare policy, or taxation, because basically you have to talk about you have to talk about national culture, Russia threat, and related issues. But now this sort of war, and this is I guess the main point of this first point, is that this war really has put this in a very new perspective, and all these conservative nationalist hawkish voices, they appear to be have been right from the start. And also that really goes together with the recent opinion in FT by the Polish Prime Minister Morawiecki, who said, we have been telling of the Putin threat of the last 20 years, but you just didn't, meaning Western European elites, but you just didn't want to listen. And we're thinking, all these, Eastern Europeans sort of being obsessed with, Russia threat. So there is a lot of soul searching, among the left and the center left in the Baltics, but in also more broadly, how to really, integrate this new turn, which sort of, so we cannot expect anything other than basically more hardening, of course, the hardening across the political spectrum, and even more sort of, but of course, all this would be, we have to take those steps, and it's very difficult. My second point is because of the, political economy, really business links with Russia, because the as I just read a recent report by Niels Redeker at Hertie, and basically about the sanctions, how the asymmetrical, same shock, different effects. Basically, the Baltics they have the highest shares both in exports and imports to and from Russia. So basically, they're hugely exposed in all sorts of ways, in all sorts of sectors, and that, of course, sits very uncomfortably with the sort of very hawkish stance, rhetoric that we have to increase, sanctions, step up sanctions, etc. I mean, I'm talking now not about the recent experience, but what happened before the invasion. And also that relates actually to the Belarus. And there was in January, there was FT reported that actually Baltics, regardless of all these, sanction talk, basically they significantly increased their trade with Belarus compared to 2020 and 21, like Estonia by double, basically. Latvia increased it by 2/3. So it's basically what I'm trying to say. The Baltics are really, there's lots of, particularly in Latvia, there lots of Russian money, and have been lots of Russian money in really strategic sectors, starting from energy, to finance, to real estate, to really the sectors which are at the heart of the political economies. But of course, it really varies across these countries, and Latvia really is the most vulnerable. It has been, for example, since the 90s, it has been a major of financial offshore of global significance, really. And as Doro has written, it really has funneled huge amounts of Russian wealth, basically kleptocratic money, to more secure places in London and elsewhere. So it's, but also not Russian money really is not limited to economy. It's or strategic economic sectors. It's also very much in culture, which really relates to the to the Latvian sort of emphasis on maintaining its their Latvian identity, and the efforts to sort of confirm their uniqueness in a broader whatever cultural scene. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is it's really a double game against the rhetoric of increasing sanctions and putting up pressure on Russia. There is really a deep reluctance, if not impossibility, to do anything meaningful. And really, the elites are really reluctant to risk viability of vitally important industries, either for growth reasons or paradoxically for cultural reasons, because as I said, a significant amount of cultural funding, which is key for the Latvian, national nation state, is actually coming from, businesses have been coming from businesses related to either from, financial sector related to Russia or big, oligarchs like Piotr Aven, who was granted the Latvian citizenship and highest national award for his support of arts and culture. He's very close to Putin and he's on the sanctions list. By the way, he is of Latvian origin. And then finally, a couple of words on domestic politics, if I have time. It's just a few. Everybody knows that the Baltics they're known for their ethnic cleavage. So basically, what matters in political competition, in political sort of game, are ethnic issues related to ethnicity, language, and relations to Russia. So basically, we cannot expect anything then deepening of those divides, which have served as very major hurdles for economic development, particularly in the more vulnerable cases like Latvia, which is really divided. And I have really anecdotal evidence, and firsthand, sort of my partner is Latvian Russian. Really, Latvian Russians are feeling very bad, I suppose, as Russians everywhere. So because they're sort of blamed for supporting Putin, even if they're far from doing that. But of course, the problem is that actually there are significant, not negligible portions of Latvian Russians who actually do feel some sort of sympathy with the Putin regime, and even with these recent activities, which is a huge problem. And this, of course, can be explained. Of course, they haven't really developed loyalty with the new sort of say nation states. So they basically they operate with what they have, with the old sort of loyalties to the Soviet Union, or that's mostly the older generation. So yeah, it's I cannot end on anything too positive, but I would end here. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Edgars. And I think we're going to come back to the Baltic states afterwards. But first, we're going to move to Russia and Anatoly. And he will be talking about kind of the relationship between the state and society in Russia. He'll be talking about the reaction of the society to the war, and also he wants to talk about kind of the domestic narratives in Russia that support the war. So Anatoly, please.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me well? Yeah, thank you, Tobias. Thank you, Dora, for inviting me to participate in this very important event. It has been very difficult to talk in the past couple of weeks, and probably it is going to be difficult now as well. But amidst the horrific things that are happening in Ukraine right now, but I will try to say a few things about two things. The first thing is the reaction of Russian civil society, and the second one is the reaction of the public opinion. There isn't really much to say about the reaction of the civil society, because as you all know, it has been severely incapacitated and crushed in the last couple of years. As of today, according to Overday Info, an NGO which is monitoring the detentions in Russia, 13,912 people have been detained during anti-war protests since February 24. There are also arbitrary checks and detentions happening in the metro, but this isn't really a news that has been happening before in Russia. When it comes to sociology and public opinion, of course, as we all know, it is very difficult to assess. Different sociological services, they give different estimates, and the events are still very fresh, so we simply do not have a lot of data for now. In addition to that, everything that is happening against the background of media landscape transforming rapidly. Since, as you probably know, the word war in relation to the events in Ukraine is banned right now in the Russian media. At the same time, the wartime censorship has been normalized. Starting with repressive media policies, as you all know, TV Rain and Echo Moskvy were forced to shut down recently. And right now, perhaps Novaya Gazeta, run by the recent Nobel Peace Prize laureate, is the only remaining stronghold of independent opinion. The rest, but including Novaya Gazeta, and the rest are forced to comply with the newly introduced legislation, which anticipates up to 12,000 euros of fines or from 3 to 15 years imprisonment for spreading or publishing false information about the actions of the Russian army in Ukraine. And this does not only apply to the journalists and the media, it also applies to private individual bloggers and so on. Many people are inventing ways to talk about this, but of course there are limitations, and these limitations are systemic and serious, and simply recalling how they used to do this during the dissident times in the Soviet Union might not be enough. More than 150 journalists, independent journalists, have left Russia since February 24. Still, we do have some reports. If we are looking at what Levada Sociological Surveys has been posting, and also there has been recently a report which is allegedly coming out of the Center for Public Opinion in Samara, but has not been confirmed so far. So I will probably stop on Levada. There was a report published on the 24th of February, and that is the ground zero for everything that is happening right now. And so if we actually look at that ground zero, we can see that as of December 2021, to the question, do you believe that these hostilities in Eastern Ukraine can turn into a war between Russia and Ukraine? And this was like one day before the war, or on the day of the war. 36% answered that it was likely, and 38% answered that it was unlikely. So the opinions were divided about that. When it comes to the main scapegoat, of course, it's America. Sanctions were inevitable, and therefore, as they are being implemented right now, the majority of the Russian population would say that, well, you know, they were inevitable. If it wasn't for the war, they would have invented something else as a pretext. There is also such thing as news saturation and fatigue. I don't know if you have had that painful experience of ever watching Russian television and political shows. I have. I try to avoid it as much as I can, but sometimes I have to. You know, in political shows, 90% of information is about Ukraine. It's about promoting the narratives that that we have been talking about before here. Also, now is a crucial moment, I think, because we are seeing some limited mobilization around the figure of the leader. So Putin's approval ratings are unfortunately going up, as has usually been the case during military conflicts. But the time is not on Putin's side here. And the key triggers for the population that could turn this around, I think, are two mostly. The first one is the longevity of the active phase of the conflict, and it is already visibly dragging on, and Russians are not performing well. And the second is the high number of casualties, both among Ukrainians and among the Russian soldiers. Of course, there is a difference between the normal situation and the routine situation. Sorry, the routine situation and the emergency situation, and some of that can be attributed to the emergency nature of that situation. But even if the estimates are times and times lower than they actually are right now, and right now more than 10,000 Russian soldiers has already been allegedly killed in Ukraine. This will have real consequences, and this will not go lightly on the regime. On the 10th of March, there has been another report about Russians' fears, and this, I think, is interesting because still the most pressing fears among the Russians are, the first place is the fear of illness of a loved one or a child, and the second is the fear of war. But of course, the reaction that we are seeing right now is the reaction to the represented image, to how it is being portrayed in the media. And once the bodies come back home, and once the economic sanctions really hit hard, then of course that could turn the picture around. The thing that I wanted to end with, I think, is the point that Yuliya Yurchenko made about the nature of the Russian regime, that this is a dysfunctional KGB-run oligarchic kleptocracy. And on top of doing everything that we can right now, like helping refugees, like trying to volunteer and mobilize, I think I also invest hope into the first and the last words in that definition, that it is dysfunctional and that it is a kleptocracy. As a friend put it very nicely recently on Facebook, is that that Z sign that they use all the time in Russia right now, that this is a new swastika, and he said that, well, it is actually a swastika, which used to be a swastika, but half of it was stolen and another half was broken. I really hope he's right, and I will end here.
Thank you very much, Anatoly. We're gonna move to the last input that is coming from Yuliya Baumann, and she will also talk about Russia, and we'll have the challenge to answer the question whether there is a chance for the conflict to be stopped from within Russia. So Yuliya, please.
Yes, thanks, Toby, and thanks also for inviting me. Well, maybe let me say a few words why I wanted to talk about this. I'm doing my PhD on opposition and elections in Russia, and I've lived for a few years in Russia, so I'm sort of befriended with people that have been going to protest the last days or that have been imprisoned recently. So therefore, I thought it would be interesting to look at whether there are any chances for this war to be stopped from within Russia. There are basically two options, either from below or from above. And I will try to add to answering this question. So I will probably not be able to answer them definitely. So as to the first one, Anatoly already spoke about the issue of public opinion polls right now. And of course, it's quite difficult. There are currently 4 polls related to the so-called special military operation in Ukraine. 2 of them were conducted by state-run pollsters, Tsiom and FOM, in the first week of the war, and 2 others that were conducted by independent sociologists. Interestingly, they more or less come to the same conclusions, and also independent or government critical sociologists confirm the findings. So therefore, I thought it would be maybe worth sharing them with you. If I may, I would maybe share my screen, so I'm not allowed. So if maybe Maximilian can give me the right, then I will try to do this.
Yeah, one sec.
I guess now you're able to.
Yes, okay, thank you. So you should be now seeing a slide with the question whether people in Russia support the military operation in Ukraine. So these are 2 sociological state-affiliated pollsters. And basically what you can see is that more than about 60% do support this military operation. Then of course, the first question would be, can we trust this data? Because, okay, it's governmental pollsters, but as I said before, there are also 2 other polls that come to quite similar conclusion. For instance, this one that was conducted by independent sociologists, and they also found that more or less 60% were supporting the war. Importantly, and this was also mentioned by Anna and Anatoly, that of course those that do trust official media, they're more likely to support the war. Why? Because they do not actually perceive it as a war, but as a military operations. And those that do not trust official media do not support the operation mostly. Of course, there are also some other keywords to these polls, namely that, well, how the questions are worded, right? So if the question is whether they support the military operation, they are not speaking about the war. Also, we do not know whether the opinion has changed so far, because the polls were conducted between the 25th and 27th of February. And finally, also, we do not know whether people would answer honestly in a situation where you are publicly forbidden to call this a war. Still, as I said in the beginning, there are indications that even if we maybe, say that 10 or 20% would not be answering honestly, still, this is also what other experts and observers in Russia say, that about half of the people seem to currently support this military operation. One other interesting finding that is also confirmed by all of these polls is actually that the answer depends on the age. So the younger the respondents, the less likely they are to support the operation, and the elderly are less likely to support the operation. And then again, this sort of depends on whether they use television as the main source of information. So like young people aged below 30 tend not to support and do not tend to watch television, and the opposite is the case for those that are aged above 60 and mostly use television as their main source of information. So maybe one parallel that many might think of now is how society has reacted to the annexation of Crimea in 2015, when there was also sort of a spike in the support to President Putin, and there has been kind of a rise in patriotic sentiments. So maybe a difference to 2014 now is that despite the rise in support, there does not seem to be such a patriotic outcry as compared to what we saw after the annexation of Crimea. And the main affiliations people have when they are asked, why do you think that Russia is doing this operation, is that first they say that, well, the security of Russian borders to protect the population in the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic. So basically they reproduce mostly these narratives that have been made available to them on public, in public media. Then the question is, okay, how about all the other millions that do not support this operation? How where do they raise their voice, and do they have the chance? I mean, we already heard that there have been nearly 14,000 people already imprisoned because they went to protest against the war. Maybe one interesting information to add to this is that OVD-Info, this protest monitoring organization, they said yesterday that they observed that there are new people coming to the protests, so people that are usually not the classic ones that go to protest and anti-regime protests. So maybe this is an interesting observation, but still you see repression is just on the rise. Within a few hours, we see new laws, new repressions happening. So I think we should not be expecting any big public protests. Also, the problem is that the protests happen quite in an uncoordinated way. So there's basically no leader or no organizer of the protest. I mean, there has been the call by Navalny and his team to go out on Sunday at 14:00 at the main sort of place in the city, but people go out in different places and different times. So this is really not very coordinated. So overall, personally, I think the prospects for public mass protests are rather bleak. Of course, we do not know what's going to happen once sanctions effects set in, right? And here there are basically two opportunities. So it might be that for some part of the population that feel the economic effects of the sanctions, they will maybe change their minds, but most likely for the majority of those that already support the operation, this will have a sort of rally around the flag effect, the bad West turning against us and trying to make us live worse. So I see I am supposed to come to an end soon. So maybe then I will just say two more words about the chances for a split of elites. Overall, the prospects are also not very positive here, but I can share with you an insight from Christo Groze from Bellingcat today, who just had the information that some parts of the elite and security structures close to Putin are quite unsatisfied and critical of the war, and they increasingly share inside information to the other side. Basically, there seems also to be an increasing number of employees at the security services who want to quit, but are actually not allowed to quit. And at the same time, today, there was also information confirmed by Andrei Soldatov, who's an investigative and journalist and Russian security service expert, on that Putin has launched a crackdown on the FSB's fifth service, which is the one who is operating as the foreign intelligence service now in Ukraine also. And yeah, it seems that the head of the service and his deputy have been placed under house arrest. So there seems to be growing dissatisfaction within security and structures. But the question is whether they will actually have the chance to express their discontent in one or the other way. And to finish, let me remind maybe us of the findings of the comparative literature on authoritarianism, that elite splits usually happen mostly unexpected. So despite I might maybe not end on a positive note, so but still we could see this in a situation where we would not expect it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, also Yuliya, and a big thanks to all of the panelists. I think we got to hear quite some valuable insights from different angles, different countries, which are all very crucial to this war. I can just remind you, and now I'm talking to the audience, if you have questions, you can just type them into the chat, and Doro and I will just raise them on your behalf. Unless there are no questions at the moment, we can either, like to the panelists, you can either complement what has been said, you can react to what other people have been saying, or if you want to raise a new point and I was too strict with my time regime, you can also just make a new point, a new argument. You can just unmute yourself, and I think we can still figure out who's going to speak next then.
Nice.
Please, Tatiana.
Okay, so I just wanted to comment briefly on this several very interesting interventions, and of course these are extremely important points. With some of them I agree. It's all very important, but it does not explain actually why Putin decided to attack Ukraine now, and it does not also explain this kind of full-scale invasion, and of course it does not justify in any ways what is happening. Yeah, so if we start like thinking about maybe this neo-Nazi stuff, you know, we are already in this Putin's narrative. And the very important intervention about disinformation is, of course, you know what's going on, like every day. There are new fakes about Ukraine, like working on nuclear weapons, on Ukraine working on chemical weapons, you know, biological weapons, which are supposed to target, I don't know, some ethnic groups and stuff like that. So we are it's a kind of crazy world we are in if we start to follow this logic by Putin. And for me it's like an irony in this that Putin decided to attack Ukraine under Zelensky, yeah, because actually Zelensky was elected on the mandate to somehow to finish this conflict. Yeah, there was no major escalation in Donbass in the last years. The Ukrainian government actually made a lot of introduced a lot of measures to improve the humanitarian situation in the Donbass, to improve the for example, the crossing of the dividing contact line. Yeah, there was also some radicals, if you wish, were brought to the court in the last years. Some institutions, like the Institute of National Memory, got a new director who embraced much more like a dialogue-oriented policy. Yeah, so if you look at this, you would ask yourself, I mean, why to attack actually Ukraine now? So maybe the question is because of this, yeah, because it was perceived by Putin as a last moment when, like, his hopes that Ukraine is divided, that President Zelensky is probably not so popular, his popularity is declining. So this was a moment of weakness, and that's why this decision was taken. But I think it's also because of the perceived weakness of the West and what was happening in the last years. You know, the US, the new US leadership, which is perceived by Russia as weak, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the COVID situation, which kind of absorbed the politicians in the West completely. All this kind of created this feeling that the West will be too busy with other things, that the West is somehow not coherent and yeah, so I think that these are questions we should ask ourselves, and we should also understand there were several publications in the Russian media kind of framing this conflict as a civilizational conflict and like Russia fighting the Western liberal order. So it's Ukraine in this fight is only one target, and I think we should be aware of this.
Yeah, thank you, Tatiana. Does any one of the panelists add on to what Tatiana has been saying just now? Please, Yuliya.
Yes, thanks. Yeah, so Tatiana, I think you raised a very important question. So why did Russia start this war now, and why did most of the expert community not predict this? So I think often this war is presented in a frame that, well, Russia has security needs, and Russia wanted to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. But to be honest, if this would have been the point, they wouldn't have needed to invade it, because they're already in Crimea, they were already in Donbass, and that would have been a major impediment for Ukraine to join NATO, similar to what has happened in Georgia and in Moldova. So I think, or it seems to be more likely for me that this the threat from Ukraine to Russia rather is related to the development within Ukraine, that Ukraine has developed in a more democratic and a more Ukrainian and Western direction, and this is a threat. I mean, that Putin and the Russian elites most likely relate to what has happened in 2004 at the Orange Revolution, at the other color revolutions, and in 2014, sort of that this model might become more attractive, that Ukraine will develop economically, politically, and socially more successfully than Russia is, and this might become a sort of attractive example for their own society. So I think this is maybe also an explanation, and also not to forget, by the way, that public opinion support for Putin and also support for United Russia had been on decline since 2018, more or less steadily, and 2021 parliamentary elections were the one where there has been more have been more falsifications than ever, like in terms in percentage. So you see, this war seems to, until now, have brought more support to the authorities. So maybe this, in combination, could be two explanations, if not, of course, not the only ones. Yeah. Thanks.
There are a couple of questions in the chat. I mean, some are related to a different region, that is the ex-Yugoslav space, and we could also talk about the Republika Srpska and also potential conflicts there. We might do a separate event on this because it's a different topic, also very crucial, also very important. But today we want to stick to Ukraine and also Russia and the Baltic states. But there's a question by Josef Melchior from the political science department, and I'm just going to read out the question, and whoever feels competent and willing to answer the question can just raise his or her voice. So the question is, how dependent is Putin on the support of the oligarchs, and may the economic sanctions have an impact on their relationship towards Vladimir Putin?
So if nobody wants to answer, I can say something. But Tatiana, you also muted yourself, so maybe you want to say something.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so you see, it's always very difficult to speak about elites' perceptions, because what we know about them is only what is sort of leaked in social media or some Telegram channels. So I think the economic sanctions do have an impact on part of the elite, of course, but to be honest, I think they already have accumulated that much of wealth that maybe it doesn't really hurt them. There are some of the oligarchs who now already kind of spoke out that they are against the war, but most likely not because they honestly feel that they should do it, but because they have so many business partners in the West and part of their companies in the West, that they know that if they would not speak out right now, then that might even have more damage to them, because Western partners would stop engaging with them or sort of publicly refrain. So I think Putin is more dependent on the support of his security services rather than the oligarchs, because he has also sort of reduced their dependence throughout his stay in power. Yeah, but for sure, it has an effect on public opinion the more people speak out, because this shapes the perception on elite support. Yeah.
I will just maybe add one point also, that that as we know from the history of previous conflicts, when sanctions hit and when oligarchs are suffering, they can be reimbursed for at least for some of their losses, as happened in the past. And so we can wait and see to what extent he will be prepared to actually reimburse all their losses. And also maybe just one thing to follow up on what Yuliya said before about Russia solving its domestic problems by foreign policy means. I mean, this has been a very widespread type of strategy historically as well. I mean, the domestic and foreign policy for Russia, discursively and also practically, has always been intertwined very closely. And I agree completely. I mean, I think this is the only logical explanation, because I saw no other logical explanation for this to happen now.
Can I intervene quickly?
Maybe I come in and ask a couple of questions that have been raised in the chat. Is that okay, or did I interrupt someone?
Yuliya just wanted to say a word, and then you can.
Sorry.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, it's the still, after all of these years, the weirdness of Zoom environment. It's just kind of to follow up on what Anatoly was saying about solving domestic problems via foreign policy. I agree about that. And you know, one of the things that I've kind of developed in my work as well, and one of the kind of one of the many skeptical moments that I argue in my work, is that, you know, when things kicked off properly in 2014, and when Minsk agreements were being negotiated, you know, like the oligarchic regime has been refused in Ukraine as well. Like people in the squares, in Maidans of all different cities, in the squares of different cities, they were booing the oligarchs who were coming onto the stage, trying to talk to them when Yanukovych was still in Kiev, you know. So there was a rejection of this, you know, of the rot in the system of Ukraine as well. And in a way, in a really perverted way, this armed conflict and the annexation of Crimea and the conflict in Donbass was a saving grace for the oligarchic regimes, because there is this kind of the word that we hear used a lot in Ukrainian political discourse since 2014 is nenachasti, which is this is not the time. So this is not the time to sort out domestic problems. This is not the time to kind of figure out like the class struggle, well, not necessarily Putin, those words, that's my terminology, but it's always like that. And like, you know, in 2015, I went to Lugansk Oblast, like quite close to the front, to the line of the front. And I spoke to the battalions who were stationed there, and I'm not going to kind of give you too much information about who I spoke to, but the general sense that I got from them, and like, you know, there are a lot of fighters who were posting their videos on social media, and you know, they were giving interviews in the press. They would say that once this is over, we're returning to Kiev and we're shooting everybody in the parliament, because they created this, the corrupt politicians in the country have created this. So in the weird, perverted way, the kind of oligarchs that managed to be sort of to hold on to their seats because the war started, including Poroshenko's presidency. He wouldn't have been the president if Russia wouldn't have annexed the Crimea by the point. The whole narrative was that Ukraine, one of the reasons there was a peaceful transfer of the Crimea, because there wasn't a legitimate commander-in-chief. Interim government, according to Ukrainian constitution, the interim president cannot declare a war. They cannot use military forces. And Putin was using this narrative saying that Ukraine doesn't have legitimate government, so we can basically do whatever we want. Should the Kiev government have started any sort of military operation, it would have further legitimized full-on incursion by Russia at the time. So that's how oligarchs, and that's how Poroshenko managed to get in on the first round of elections, because there was this whole narrative around the presidential campaign that we need a commander-in-chief, we need somebody who's experienced, we need somebody who knows the ropes, because there are already things kicking off bad in the east of the country, right? So that kind of, there is realization amongst the rulers, the capitalists of Ukraine, that there is a lot of frustration in the country. And also when the country is in a state of war, you can write off any sort of economic problems. You can say that this is because of the war, this is not because we're not coping, this is not because we're stealing, this is not because money is mismanaged, right? So it's a very convenient thing to any regime that is failing to provide for its citizens. It's a very convenient thing to do, like as horrendous as it is, it's true, right? So, and of course I agree that, you know, Putin is a sort of like his regime is on the last legs. And this was this kind of like, you know, last opportunity of getting into Ukraine. While Poroshenko was still in power, there was this whole kind of, you know, militarization, and we're building the big nation. And like, you know, he quite liked being this kind of big man of the army. And then comes in Zelensky with his let's end the war. And well, you can't quite very easily keep justifying this kind of aggressive foreign policy. So you start inventing kind of additional narratives as to why the pretense of potential aggression from Ukraine, it needed to happen now. Like it was difficult, it wasn't safe to wait any longer. But again, we know that this further escalation, the incursion into Ukraine, has been planned for years. There are lots of what's called diversante. There are a lot of sleepers in the country who put markers on buildings for the fire correction. They've been like, you know, where I live, like around where I am right now in Vienna, there are lots of them were captured in the forest near the hydroelectric dam. There are electric sensors being put on strategic objects so that the signal can be read of them, so that Russians know where to fire their rockets. And that kind of infiltration has been planned for years. Like it was planned in Donbass before 2013, it's been planned for years all the way through Ukraine, and we shouldn't underestimate the degree of sympathy. And like we don't know the exact numbers of how many sympathetic people, like what Anna was telling us, are around Ukraine who actually do agree with this kind of narrative of Putin. So this is something that we really need to understand, and like, you know, and the degree of destitution and dispossession in Ukrainian and Russian societies alike made them quite, like the dispossession and the frustration with those in power makes them quite vulnerable and susceptible to certain manipulating narratives of politicians who are quite, you know, sometimes they're a bit lazy and wobbly, and kind of it's a bit funny what they're like, almost funny what kind of narratives they're trying to push and what kind of fakes they create, but very often it's quite powerful propaganda. And if you hear just something often enough and frequently enough and long enough, you're going to start believing it, especially if you don't have any other narratives come in. So that's kind of what I wanted to add on that point.
I see that Anna wants to say something. Anna, in addition to your reaction to what was just said, could I also ask you, because somebody in the chat asked, he, I think, would be interested in how the panel judges the effects of social media communication of the Ukrainian government, whether
I'd
institute.
like to say something regarding to what Yuliya just said.
Yes. I just wanted to bring in that additional question as well, if you feel.
Okay.
Yes.
I would say, like, I really strongly agree with what Yuliya just said, and I think what's also really interesting of like this class-driven dimension of interest in Ukraine. I mean, I have read that the disinformation in Ukraine, which is sponsored or like led by pro-Russian oligarchs, is not led by Russian interests. It's more led by financial interests of those people that just want to cooperate with Russia. And I think this is insane how much financial interests of individuals just form this public opinion just form this public opinion and lead to distrust. So yeah, that's just something I'm really mad about.
If I may, I wanted to address this question on the effects of social media communication of the Ukrainian government very briefly. I cannot, of course, judge for others, and my material is limited. But I subscribe to several Telegram channels when the war started, basically to follow what's going on the ground and what is happening to my friends. And I must say, not only the government, but also the local authorities are using Telegram very effectively, I think, to reach people, to inform them about, not only to inform them about what's going on, but to address humanitarian needs, to give information where they can get humanitarian aid, what's going on in the city, and so on. And this is kind of constant communication, which I think is very important, but then still limited to those people who have access to internet and iPhones. And I'm afraid to think what is happening, for example, to all the people who are watching TVs, and the Russian army is trying to destroy TV transmitters. Yeah, so they hit the TV tower in Kiev, they hit the TV tower in Kharkiv, and the Ukrainian authorities restored it, but still people, of course, have not enough access to the information. And in the territories which were occupied in the last days, like in Kherson, the first thing what the occupational authorities do is, of course, to install their media and to put pressure on local journalists and to change the informational agenda. And this is, of course, what when we are watching what's going on in the media nowadays, I think it's a very dangerous situation, because people are totally disoriented if they don't know whom to believe, and there are all kinds of fakes and denunciations, and even sitting in the West, I have difficulties to understand what is true and what is not true. Yeah, but it must be very hard for people on the ground.
Okay, I see that we have still a number of people who want to tell something. And given that officially we are at the end of our time, my suggestion is that we basically take 15 more minutes, but not more, because then I think people will also be tired and need to go. And what I will do now, I will ask a couple of questions, and then whoever, I mean, I will ask specific questions, but also questions that were answered that were asked in the chat, and whoever feels that he wants to tell something about them, please do so. So the first question is, Edgars had to leave. That's a pity. I wanted to ask him, but maybe somebody else has also any thoughts on this? If not, then not. But I want to combine two things. What Tatiana told, that she said this, that there is an attempt to create, or an attempt with a strategy to create a refugee problem in order to show how the EU cannot act basically on the refugee issues. At the same time, but Edgars told that if you look at any kind of repercussions of the sanctions, they mostly hit Eastern European countries, especially the Baltics and Poland. So my question is, it's again peeping into the future, but how long is basically this very strong resolve of the Baltic countries and Poland going to last to keep through with the sanctions and with the refugees? So I think that I would be, if anybody has any view on this, that would be my question. Then we have one question, which is one that often comes up, especially with the Western left, and I want to give if you want the panel from the chat, I want to give the panel a chance to react to is, how much is the war a mistake or the responsibility of NATO? So if you want to react on this, please be my guest, whoever wants. And then the third question I would like to specifically ask to Yuliya, you promised a reconstruction plan, and I think we would be happy to hear more about this, maybe at the very end, if that's okay, because that maybe gives us some hope for the future. So I know basically take whoever still wants to say something. So Anatoly.
I raised my hand before you formulated the questions that you were interested in, Laura. So
I'm happy to hear also what you have to say.
No, it's just a very quick thing. I mean, I just wanted to address something that was a question that was raised in the chat. So how do those two things square? The extreme irrationality of Putin's speeches and the kleptocratic dysfunctional nature of the regime. I think in retrospect, it makes perfect sense whatever he was promoting in his extremely irrational speeches and publications. I mean, how do you motivate and mobilize the population of a country or an army of a country to go fight its neighbor with whom they share a language and so on? I mean, the first thing you do is you dehumanize the Ukrainians. You present their country as non-existent, as a patchwork of different presents that were given to it throughout Soviet history and so on. So in this case, I think it makes perfect sense. It is very cynical. It is very horrible to promote such kind of narratives, but I don't think that being cynical and horrible is what Putin is afraid of. With regards to NATO's fault, I mean, I see this as a very dangerous type of logic. I mean, yes, Gorbachev received a verbal promise. Now we know that the documents have been declassified. It was one of the major lines of narratives during the reunification of Germany that NATO will not go 1 inch to the east. But then, so what? It's politics. And if we continue, you know, thinking in these terms, being angry and bitter at NATO for not fulfilling its promises, then I don't think we will end up in a better world.
Anyone else wants to address any of the issues?
Well, I could speak to the NATO quickly.
Yes.
Just very briefly that, you know, well, first of all, it was a kind of, you know, as promises go, it was a promise made to the president of a currently non-existent country. So a verbal promise. And after that, Russia has made a written promise in the memorandum when Ukraine has given up its nuclear weapons to protect it from further attack. And then it ripped it apart, it threw it in the bin and attacked Ukraine because it has beef with NATO while Ukraine is not in NATO. So that's some sort of really serious mental acrobatics that we're talking about, right? And ironically enough, now when Russia attacked Ukraine in 2014, there hasn't the support for NATO was something just over 40%, depending on the region. Like on average, like the average in the country was about 40% for NATO membership. Now it's over 60. It's like 64 or something. I saw the latest stuff. But even think about this: the country has been in the state of war with Russia for 8 years, and it's still not 80, 90 or anything percent. So, and Putin knows that NATO is not stupid enough to accept Ukraine as its member. It's apologism for its neo-imperialistic ambitions, for its narcissistic, entitled behavior that, you know, it's okay somehow to invade neighboring countries because I don't feel like I'm treated important enough. I think the framework or the frame of domestic violence and narcissistic relationships is very useful when we're trying to understand the behavior of Russia to Ukraine. It's like when your partner beats you because you provoked him, because he's, you know, he's had a bad day at work, so he's going to beat his wife. That's exactly the same kind of logic, and we've seen that kind of behavior from colonial imperialistic states all the way through history. So there is nothing quite new here. So that's that. I guess the thing is that, you know, so that's the logical analysis of this. Yet at the same time, I do think that NATO had no business expanding post-91. They should have disbanded altogether, because I believe in demilitarization of the world. And I think having more weapons all over the place is not really making the world safer, because the more you invest, you know, the warning of Eisenhower in 1953 resonates louder now than it has then. You know, the military industrial complex of the United States specifically and the world generally has grown completely out of proportion. And if you put as much effort, as much money and as much research into building the most high-tech weapons, well, you're not building them to stack them in the museums, are you? You're going to need to look for wars. And it's not about being conspiracists. Like, you know, look at how armed the domestic police in the United States is. It's like all of these disused vehicles that have been built for heavy military operations in all sorts of different places, and carry arms of insane proportions have been taken through towns of the United States. It's crazy. So we need to be talking about demilitarization. I think in a large scheme of things, we need to be as a long-term plan talking about large-scale demilitarization of the world, and it has to start with the United States. If it doesn't start with the United States, there is no chance.
Okay. I suggest, unless anyone wants to chip in, I would ask Yuliya for a last word on her reconstruction plan. I guess the big demilitarization might already be part of it. So please, Yuliya.
Thank you. Yeah, a bit of hope. I've been always criticized, well, frequently criticized for spreading doom and gloom. So, okay, the optimism of the spirit needs to shine through towards the end. So here it is. I'm involved, I'm a founding member of the Socialny Ruch, a social movement, political organization of progressive left in Ukraine. We were founded on the 1st of May, 2015. It was a beautiful sunny day, after which I got on the train and went to Luhansk Oblast to see with my own eyes what Russia has done there. And this is with them and with the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign in London. We've been doing a lot of work on kind of how to support Ukraine in the immediate, short-term, mid-term, and long-term, dealing with the challenges of socioeconomic disruption, oligarchs, kind of erosion of sovereignty through its relationships with its lenders. Ukraine is the second biggest lender with on the outstanding debt with IMF, but it also has a lot of other lenders. And it comes, of course, everybody here, I suspect, knows, with a lot of conditionality that cripples the sovereignty of autonomy of decision-making, even for the most well-meaning politicians, should they come to power in Ukraine. So we have been developing together a couple of ideas of what needs to happen to Ukraine immediately in short and mid and long term, in order for it to be able to rebuild itself, because otherwise this kind of socioeconomic disruption and destitution breeds conflict, makes people susceptible to all sorts of propaganda, right-wing twists and all sorts of stuff. So demilitarization, absolutely, that needs to happen on the global scale. And in Ukraine now, there's been this law adopted extraordinary, kind of on a speedy procedure that allowed civilians to carry arms, which allowed to arm the territorial defense battalions. I'm really concerned about that law because it wasn't adopted as something that's extraordinary for the time of war. It was adopted as a regular law that allows to carry arms for the civilians. And that will not be very easy to revoke, I don't think so, but it has to be. Because in the country that's going to be trying to rebuild and reconciliate after such a heavy military conflict, people should not be allowed, average people traumatized by war shouldn't be allowed to carry arms. That needs to, that really needs to happen. And of course, demilitarization needs to happen on the global level, because if you just tell Ukrainians give up arms after they've given up their nuclear weapons and then suffered invasion from their guarantor, it's not going to be very convincing if they're the only ones being asked to demilitarize. So that needs to happen. But then on the socioeconomic level, so what some of the things that we're working on right now is one is a petition on the cancellation of the state debt, foreign debt, which I'm going to stick it in the chat so that you can share it should you choose to do so. Petition, there it is. So we have been working with the Debt Jubilee campaign and with a bunch of different organizations here in Ukraine, and with the Ukraine Solidarity campaign and with my research network, trying to push that agenda, because no country in the state of war that is fighting on behalf of Europe and the whole world should be asked to pay interest on its debts. This is simply barbaric. This shouldn't be happening. So some of the things that we're working on right now is at least temporary moratorium on repayment while we're working on full-on write-off of that debt, and a plan for large-scale macroeconomic assistance aid, which I class as reparations for the inaction in the last 8 years. This war could have been prevented, and it wasn't. And Ukraine is now fighting it in its sacrificing its cities, its lives, its infrastructure on behalf of the whole world. And it needs to be compensated for it. No conditions asked. Well, there are conditions on the Ukrainian side. So how can it happen so that oligarchs don't steal it again? We need to have a transfer of, because it's not only about Russian oligarchs or American oligarchs ripping the country apart. It's about Ukrainian oligarchs as well. One of the reasons that Ukraine is so divided and is so broke is because there is large embezzlement of money that ends up here, and also of the profits of the oligarchic enterprises. So what we need to do is under the EU of EU, perhaps, or whoever that is that will be part of this kind of reconstruction plan making, if the EU is serious about de-oligarchization of Ukrainian economy, they should allow for transfer of the ownership and management of oligarchic enterprises into the hands of its workers. And that way, those who are collectively owning an enterprise are not interested in stealing from it, because it's their livelihood. And there is a mutual control and assurance and kind of peer observation. So that needs to happen. Next thing that needs to happen is relaxation of conditionalities of doing everything through the market that is part of the Deep Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement. That would, and relaxation of state aid rules that would allow Ukrainian state to fund, to do its kind of post-Keynesian, whatever you want to call it, state investment politics, reconstruct its infrastructure, invest in social services, invest in welfare, rebuild the economy from below above, and support its small and medium enterprises as well that are currently really suffering in the conditions of unfair competition that are being put in, and a lot of different standards that they have to adhere to as part of the kind of pro-EU transformation processes. So these are kind of some of the broad strokes along which we are working, and I think that if those things that are so, like, why is it okay to if we're sanctioning Russian oligarchs, sanction Ukrainian oligarchs as well? We know why there is this resistance, because then you have to change the international infrastructure of transfer payments and offshore that would hurt Western oligarchs, and nobody likes that narrative. But we can at least go after Ukrainian and Russian oligarchs for now. So these are kind of some of the broad ideas on which on which we are working right now. Any further ideas are welcome. I will keep you posted with how we develop these things further. And I am hopeful. And also with the Dead Jubilee campaign, we're taking Ukraine as a precedent. We're trying to work out a protocol that would be automatically triggered in international financial institutions if and when any country goes into a serious state of crisis, then, and if they have outstanding debts or like serious financial commitments, that would be triggered. So they don't have to campaign, but they can actually focus on rebuilding their society. So that's kind of, yeah, I'm going to stop there because we're already just been on time. And any further details, I think we can have more events and more conversations.
Yeah, I think this is highly needed. Thanks, Yuliya, for your reconstruction plan. We've come to an end, at least for today. I think we covered a lot. Obviously, we were not able to cover everything because there are so many things happening at parallel. So I think this is just the end for today. And I would like to thank the 6 panelists, Tatiana, Yuliya, Anna, Edgars, Anatoly, and Yuliya, for their input. Thank you also to Doro for organizing it. Thanks for Max for the technical support. I think we could have spent another panel or 2 just on Yuliya's reconstruction plan. And there's also much to cover. So let's just keep in touch, keep a close eye on what's happening in Ukraine and the post-Soviet space. And thanks a lot for your attention also in the audience. We were not able to answer all questions, but I think if you have a specific question to one of the panelists, you can just reach out to him or her. I thought there were some questions about literature tips and so on. So just feel free to be in touch with the panel. Great. So that's it. Thanks a lot for all participants, and let's just hope for the best.
Thank you also very much from my side, and especially the panelists, but also Tobias, Max, and the audience.